Hey there. I am here with our read aloud book, Escaping the Nazis on the Kindertransport. We are on chapter 7. This chapter is called She Never Forgot Her Mother's Face. And the child's name is Ursula Rosenfeld. And at the beginning of the chapter, it has a picture of Ursula, who was known as Uli to her friends and family. And this picture was taken in 1948. So that's what she looks like back then. Ursula Rosenfeld never forgot her mother's face. That summer day at the train station, Ursula was 14 years old and she was leaving. She had gotten a place on the Kindertransport train to England. She must go. Germany was no longer safe for Jewish children, but in the midst of all the chaos, all the pushing and shouting, being poked with the corners of other suitcases, all the jostling and crying, Ursula must have seen nothing but her mother's face. When she was an old woman, many decades later, Ursula told an interviewer, quote, "The parting was terrible. That's the one thing I've never forgotten in all my life. And my mother had been so controlled. She'd always been sort of a solid support to us, and suddenly she showed her feelings, and it was terrifying, really terrifying. You saw this face that showed all the hurt and agony she'd been through. I would have liked to have had a happier image of my mother. That's the only image, this contorted face full of agony. It's very sad." We can imagine the train whistle blowing. "All aboard!" the conductor might have yelled in German over the crowd of frightened children and weeping parents. Ursula memorized her mother's face. The train was crammed with children crowded up against each other. The journey must have been terrifying. At the German border, the wheels slowed to a stop. The children sat up, murmuring and looking around. What would happen now? Nazi border guards rolled back the door and stepped onto the train. They wanted to frighten the children. Ursula recalled, the Nazi border guard very officiously came around, made some of the children open their suitcases. They shouted at us and threw their weight about. When the guard left, one can imagine a collective sigh of relief among the children, and then the mood shifted. The train pulled out of Germany and onto Dutch soil. Years later, Ursula remembered, and she wrote, "Not only were the frontier guards on the Dutch side very nice, they had a contingent of ladies who brought us cocoa and Dutch zwieback, which are sweet crackers. And it was like manna from heaven. It was wonderful. We suddenly felt as though you'd been clad in a cloak of lead or iron and it had been taken from you. It was a wonderful feeling of freedom. We started to smile. I don't think any of them had smiled in a long time, and it was wonderful." Nothing had been wonderful in Ursula's life for a very long time. Under Nazi rule, prejudice against Jews had been increasing. Ursula recalled the first time she realized she was different, and she wrote, "I was just about 8 years old when Hitler came to power. I got some school friends, and my mother always tried to make a birthday party for us. The table was set. I was sort of very excited. Nobody came. Not a single child came to this birthday party. That was the first terrible blow to me. I know it sounds trivial, but it was the first comprehension for a child to realize there was something different about you." Oppression was closing in around the Rosenfelds. Ursula must have felt it because she recalled a strong sense of the horror that was to come. "I had had a strange dream in the night that my father was being arrested," she told her interviewer years later. "Our evening meal that evening, that was the last meal I ever remember having with my father. I looked at him and thought, well, I haven't really seen his features properly, and you know how you look at someone intensely. I looked at him and thought I should imprint his features in my mind. That meal was to be the last time Ursula would see her father. The next day, her world fell apart." And there's a picture on this page of Ursula and her sister around 1931. So that's a picture when she was younger and her sister. So the next day, her world fell apart, and Ursula wrote, "Our school happened to be just opposite on the street where the synagogue was. I was dragged out with a stream of children. Everybody went to the playground to watch these flames, and suddenly someone said, 'Oh, there's a Jew! Let's throw her on the fire as well!' I don't know how I got home that day. I still don't know how I got home. And when I got home, My mother was absolutely shocked. My father had been arrested. My father was quite an outspoken person, and so when they came and took away all the men's braces and shoelaces, he protested and said, "You can't treat these old people like this." So they made an example of him, and they beat him to death in front of everybody in order to instill terror and obedience. They offered us my father's ashes in return for money. And eventually the urn came, and we buried it in the Jewish cemetery. But of course, whether it was his ashes, no one really knows. That day was the end of school for Ursula. It was the end of family life. It was the end of childhood. The days that followed must have felt like a march of terror. The family sat during the week-long mourning period for her father, and then they found that the Nazis had stopped their bank account. Her mother could not get any money from the bank. They had only the food that was still in the house. They would have starved, except that people left them baskets of food. Ursula clung to these shreds of kindness. The world had not gone completely to pieces then, not if there were still people that would bring them baskets. The situation was becoming too dangerous. Ursula's mother knew she had to get her daughter out of their town. She sent Ursula to the Jewish orphanage in Hamburg, Germany, where her sister had already been placed. There, they would be safe. They could go to the Jewish school in Hamburg. War was drawing closer to Germany, though. It was spring 1939, and the Jews had to get out. Through the orphanage, Ursula and her sister learned that Britain's government had offered to take 10,000 children. Each child had to have a sponsor, though. Ursula had an uncle who in 1933 had been able to escape the Nazis. He had been smuggled out in a coffin and had made his way to South Africa. He lived there now, in Johannesburg, and he had money. He would pay for their expenses in Great Britain, if they were able to get on the Kindertransport. Ursula's mother, alone in their town with her elderly mother-in-law, was thankful. The children would be able to get out and survive. Ironically, though, it was her beloved father's violent death that saved Ursula. She told an interviewer, "In hindsight, I think my sister and we owe my father's death that we have survived, because they selected children who had a problem, who'd lost parents or whose parents could no longer look after them, to go on the Kindertransport." On July 18, 1939, Ursula boarded the train. She kissed her mother and held back her tears, and she turned her eyes to the future. And that is the end of that chapter. So I'll see you back here for chapter 8.